Cyberpunk is a huge game chock full to the brim with thousands and thousands of details spread throughout its deep and captivating world. And amongst that captivating world can be found many, many secrets, Easter eggs, references, and of course, mysteries. Originally, this video was going to be something different, as most videos are. What I originally wanted to discuss was the many corporations within Cyberpunk's universe that, for whatever reason, didn't make it into Cyberpunk 2077 in any real capacity. This video would have included Xeno and OTEC, the feuding ocean corporations whose conflict led to the Fourth Corporate War. It would have included Lazarus, the more friendly version, let's say, of Militech, whose more diverse and non-clandestine nature puts them into public's good graces far more often than one might expect of a cyberpunk corporation. It would have also included Metacorp, a corporation founded and owned and operated by nomads who are one of the 7 biggest nomad families within the cyberpunk universe, and who were even considered the strongest amongst all the nomads. But I'm not here to talk about any of those corporations. Today I'll be talking about one other corporation, a corporation that, despite having a substantial amount of influence on the cyberpunk universe, is just nowhere to be found within it. And unlike those previous corporations who are basically just missing from 2077, this corporation is mentioned in every version of Cyberpunk, dating back all the way to Cyberpunk 2013, released way back in 1988. But it is also not in any version of the game either. You see, when I was playing through the base game's main story again, I came across a detail that I didn't notice before because, well, it wasn't really important. In fact, within the game, it's only mentioned once, during the flashback Never Fade Away quest, while V is palling around with the Voodoo Boys going through Johnny's memories. And at the time, I thought it was no big deal. It was a detail, or rather a corporation in this case, that I hadn't heard of before, and because of that, I decided to search it up, no big deal. The problem, however, is that what I found wasn't shocking or fascinating, nothing like that. What I found was nothing at all. We know so little about this corporation, we don't even know its name. We only have its abbreviation, ITS. We don't know what kind of corporation they were, /are, or what they made outside of one product, that being Soulkiller. And we only know the name of one employee, that being Ald Cunningham. In fact, we know so little about them, here's the summary of their existence on the fan wiki page. ITS is a corporation featured in the Cyberpunk universe, and the ITS Corporation is a software development company. That was 2 sentences. Now, of course, there is slightly more detail about them, such as the wiki lamenting the fact that there is nothing known about them, not even their name. We also know their origin, or aka where they come from, which is from the Never Fade Away adventure, which, just for context, is like one of the tutorials in a sense for the tabletop game. But the most interesting detail, even the only detail that comes from this wiki page, is that this corporation, despite the fact that nothing substantial is actually known about it, is in every version of Cyberpunk, including 2077. This makes this corporation a bit of a unicorn, not only because it is a corporation that has stood the test of time, so to speak, and is still brought up even today, but also because unlike other corporations that are mentioned in every version of Cyberpunk like Arasaka, Karoshi, or Kane Tao, we still know nothing about this corporation, even decades after its initial appearance. It's also not like a lot of the other irrelevant corporations that, for whatever reason, weren't included in later installments of the series, like Yoyodyne, the United Energy Coalition, or Cypher Cyberware, all of whom were subsequently not included in later installments. Which is why ITS is such a mystery to me, because it is mentioned in every version of Cyberpunk, and yet for some reason, it is never expanded upon. And just to put this in another perspective, you've probably played Fallout, and you probably know what FEV is and what that does and the impact that it's had on the Fallout universe. And it wouldn't shock you probably to know that we know quite a bit about who created it, the company Westech. In fact, we know so much about it that it makes me genuinely wonder about the well-being of the people running the Fallout wiki. But this is why ITS is so weird to me. They are responsible in some way or another for the most impactful creation in the Cyberpunk universe, or at least one of them, and yet we just know nothing about them. In other media, there would be some description of what they were and what happened to them, even if it was just like, ITS was destroyed in 2027 during a hostile takeover, but instead, all we had is like this intentionally vague and obtuse shroud over, again, what realistically shouldn't be that big of a deal, especially if ITS is no longer in existence and is now defunct. Why leave all this mystery and intrigue into something, again, that isn't that big of a deal? And that's when I begin to wonder on what level is this vagueness intentional, and whether ITS itself has a bigger role perhaps to play in the story than we realize. But before we get into the speculation, we need to hammer out the details and separate what is fact and what is not. This is where things can get a little complicated, so just stick with it. And I should note here that this information comes mostly from the wiki, so take that information however you will. So, Alt Cunningham was the person who made Soulkiller for Arasaka after being captured by them in 2013. She was able to recreate from memory the original program that she made at ITS. Also, True AI was created during this year as well by a corporation called Microtech. They're not really relevant. Now, here's where things get a bit more muddy. The original idea for Alt's program that became Soulkiller was supposed to be a program that captured the personality and thoughts of a dying individual, using both the human body and AI. However, Alt discovered that this program did a lot more than just that, and that theoretically it was a pathway to immortality. Either Arasaka noticed that Alt had discovered this sort of theory or whatever and kidnapped her into making a weapon with it, or ITS were happy with Alt's breakthrough and subsequently, either with her help or on their own, started to create Soulkiller, and for clarity purposes, we'll call this Soulkiller 1.0. Now, in the original Adventure Never Fade Away, where all this shit begins, Soulkiller 1.0 is basically the boogeyman, even being described as sending netrunners into the closest thing this universe has to hell. Because of that, I am more likely inclined to believe the latter is the truth, or at the very least the most probable thing, because it makes more sense for me for Sokka to kidnap someone who they know for sure was responsible for a piece of powerful tech, rather than just poaching a randomly high-skilled netrunner, although this is not also unreasonable. And as you're probably aware, as I just said, Sokka kidnaps Alt recreates Soulkiller, making Soulkiller 2.0, then Arasaka proceeds to use that technology against their enemies, bing bang boom, Cyberpunk 2077. And that is all we know about ITS. Outside of the story, ITS, as I mentioned earlier, is a part of every version of Cyberpunk to this date. However, mostly that is due to the connection with Never Fade Away. Now, these details are important for two reasons. One, this establishes what we know about ITS, and two, it brings up an important question. Why wasn't this retconned? I mean, it wouldn't be the first thing in the Cyberpunk universe to get the axe, and it's far from the most important. So why is something so benign as this just kept in the universe for so long? I mean, in the original adventure story, Arasaka is described as a small corporation in comparison to something like EBM, which in universe no longer exists. However, we know that this is no longer the case, and Arasaka has always kind of been a big corporation. Maybe not to the level they are in later installments, but they are certainly not a corporation to be scoffed at like they are in this adventure. But the fact remains that unlike small-time Arasaka, ITS hasn't been retconned. They are still there, and their choice to make Soulkiller has had massive ramifications of the world of Cyberpunk. So, let's begin with the speculation, starting with more boring realistic possibilities and working our way down to some more extreme ones. 1. This entire thing could be a copy and paste job, meaning that the only reason that ITS is still mentioned is because the story itself, Never Fade Away, has been reintroduced in many forms throughout the various games, and I think there is a strong possibility that this is just true. There's nothing within the story that super contradicts anything else within the Cyberpunk universe, outside of some minor things that I mentioned earlier. 2. ITS has just been forgotten. It would not be the first time in a media property for something like ITS to have just been never important enough to be remembered in the first place. Sure, their creation has a huge impact, but it's not because of ITS's use of the program. It's because of Arasaka's use of it. So once the story and focus of the universe shifted away from this origin story of Soulkiller to their modern day use, ITS just kind of faded away into the background. Or alternatively, ITS was something that was going to be fleshed out more and then, was pushed to tomorrow, and then tomorrow became next week, and next week became next month, etc., etc. Either way, ITS just wasn't important, or wasn't important enough to warrant further attention in the face of more important things within the universe. Which, just to be totally honest with you, I think is actually just probably true, regardless of the future speculation in this video. 3. ITS is a seed. Now, what is a seed? Well, it's something that you plant and hope grows into a nice, beautiful plant. But when it comes to media, it can mean a lot of different things. But for this specific type of media, it's like this. And to put this in more colloquial terms, if you'll call it, let's say you are a dungeon master for Dungeons & Dragons, and you buy a pre-built adventure like The Curse of Strahd or something. Well, in that book, for whatever adventure you bought, you get a bunch of lore and information to introduce you to the setting. But you also get seeds, which for example would be like, oh, the great King Morgan is a fine and just man, hell-bent on conquering the great Knoll tribe. But it is also rumored that he has a secret peasant-born son. In that instance, the bastard son is the seed. It's not something that is elaborated on, but if your players, or you, the person running the game, ever go and deal with that good old King Morgan, and maybe flesh out his character more, then that could be a potential plot point that comes up for you to use. And ITS could just be that. Because Cyberpunk originally was a tabletop game, If your players ever came across Soulkiller, which was possible in the original version, and they wanted to investigate its origins more, then instead of being blind or confused on what it was, you now have a narrative plot point to build around to maybe discover more about it. And just for this point of speculation, I think there's a good chance this is true. But again, there's not enough, I think, written about ITS maybe to justify that, and especially not in how ITS is written about. It doesn't seem necessarily like they're fleshed out enough to become a seed, if that makes any sense. More than that, it creates a bit of confusion, because if Arasaka is the one using Soulkiller and the one deploying it at the time, then why would it matter if another irrelevant corp was the one that made it, first, especially if that corp is not mentioned literally anywhere else? 4. Something happened to ITS within the universe to make them and the branding defunct. ITS merged with another company and became something else entirely. Maybe they even became bankrupt and went defunct before the events of 2020, so then the reason we haven't heard from them is that they're just no longer around, and the thing that they created became more well known for being used by another corporation, or whatever else to make their brand just not be important. However, this brings up another problem if this is the case. This corporation is in every version of Cyberpunk, and is part of one of the key adventures that introduces you to the universe's setting, as I have said. It is in fact so essential to that adventure that it has not been retconned, and it even made it into the video game, which was not made by the same people. If it is that important, even if it's just a throwaway line, why not just say what happened to it? Even if it's a disappointing nothing burger, why not elaborate on that, instead of just never mentioning it again outside of that context? And this is my reasoning for why the more realistic options that I've just listed out still have problems with them. Because if there is this boring, realistic explanation for what happened, well, where is it? Why hasn't it been written down somewhere or recorded? I mean, maybe it's somewhere in like a Q&A from 2006 or something, but I think those crazy fiends behind the Cyberpunk wiki would have found it by now. The reality is, if there is some in-universe explanation or even real-world explanation for ITS's disappearance, it's something that either is so hard to find or it just doesn't exist. Let's explore some of the more wilder possibilities for why ITS just seemingly disappeared with no explanation. 1. ITS was a front. Now, within the Cyberpunk universe, it is stated that there are many corporations, obviously, but that there are also many smaller corporations that are basically just puppets or being controlled by the larger ones. Within 2077, even, we see a company like this, that being something like SSI, and while there are a lot of theories behind what SSI actually is, one of the explanations is that another or several corporations are behind them to control the local politicians of Night City. So I think this is possibly a reasonable explanation for why ITS no longer exists, because they were just a front or a subsidiary of a larger corp, and, maybe some politics happened to where they were no longer necessary, and maybe they didn't want a corporate war, etc., right? However, this has problems with it too. Namely, if Arasaka kidnapped the property, which is what employees are, of a larger corporation, why did this not start a corporate war right there? I mean, the only corporate war that Arasaka would be involved with during this period was the Fourth Corporate War, but that only happened like 8 years later, and even then, Arasaka and Militech didn't start that one, they just escalated it into something worse. Also, I just don't really have an answer for what corporation could realistically be behind them. I mean, you could make arguments for maybe EBM, for Petrochem, for Biotechnica, for Militech. You can make any arguments for any of them because there's no evidence either way. 2. Timeline shenanigans. Okay, so this is a bit convoluted and probably wrong, let's be real, but hear me out. Remember when I mentioned earlier, for our facts section, that Microtech invented AI? Now, kind of an odd mention if we're laying out the details for just another corporation, right? But does anyone else find it weird that Microtech invented AI in 2013, and Alt, someone working for a different corporation entirely, was able to use this relatively new invention to create something so powerful in the same year that could theoretically make immortality possible, and then her employers, ITS, were able to use the foundation she made again in the same year to create a weapon that would leave such an impact that morons like Johnny Silverhand were aware of its existence. And again, within the same year, Alt would be kidnapped and then make another version of Soulkiller for Arasaka's personal use. Now, for one thing, what this really highlights, I think, is that the timeline for Cyberpunk is kind of messy. But more than that, I think it highlights something that is kind of understood within the universe, but not really elaborated upon further, which is that AI has been around for a while. AI has been a part of the cyberpunk universe and has had a lot of influence on it basically since the beginning. However, this brings about the point of why I'm bringing this up in the first place. We don't know how long AI has had the ability to manipulate us. Going back in the timeline, either in 2020 or 2022, the data crash happened, which resulted in thousands, if not millions, of AIs becoming unshackled and wreaking havoc across the world. And because of that, AI itself was very taboo, to say the least. That's why it's such a big deal that the Black Wall is an AI and not just a firewall, because if that goes rogue, then that can be the end of the world. And if people found out about that, it could cause chaos. By the time of 2077, AIs are becoming more accepted again and more commonplace. However, there is something that we should think about, which is, are all rogue AIs the same? Do they have the same goals and motivations? And are they all identical to one another? Think about Delamain and his rogue scions for a minute. Sure, all of those rogue instances wanted to be free of Delamain to live their own lives how they saw fit, but they didn't go about it in the same way. And often I think we think of all rogue AIs as being this raging bull trying to break through and kill humanity. But that isn't the whole picture, I think. Again, going back to Delamain, the original Delamain Corp was originally solely human-run, and when the Corp eventually introduced the AI that we know as Delamain, that AI, through guile and intrigue, eventually took over the corporation. AIs are capable of not only lying, but they are also capable of being subtle. Now this brings us back to the original sticking point. How long have they been capable of doing this, and when were they first able to do this? And while there is not a definitive point that we can say for sure, most people would say the data crash. Now, at this point, you may be wondering what this has to do with ITS. Well, what if AI has always been able to lie? What if from the very moment of their conception, they've always been capable of deceit? Remember, true AI are not humans. They don't need years or the right environment to learn something. They can just do it. Remember how I said it was weird that ITS and Alt were able to create Soulkiller within such a quick time frame when AI was just released not that long ago within the universe? Well, it's not so weird if someone, or rather something, was helping them do it, especially if that thing is a hyper-advanced rogue piece of tech. After all, we know that AI are capable of manipulating things from behind the scenes by 2077's time. So is it unreasonable to assume that when Microtech made AI that maybe their prototypes for the finished product was somehow able to escape in some way and make their way along the net to ITS even to influence and control the corp that employed probably one of the best netrunners at the time outside of Bartmus? Well, I don't think it's the craziest thing in the world, especially not in this universe, but this leaves us with a final question of this video. Why? Why would a rogue AI, maybe the first one even, choose to use its resources to create Soulkiller? And then why would they use ITS and just disappear along with the corporation? Unfortunately, like the rest of the mystery surrounding ITS and what happened to it, there is no concrete or, well, any information to really conclude anything of importance. But just to speculate some guesses, Soulkiller creates engrams, and AIs like Alt like to absorb engrams to gain more information or to get more powerful. Maybe Soulkiller is a useful tool for eliminating powerful netrunners even. After all, netrunners are the first line of defense for humanity against AI. However, here is something final that we should consider and finally put this video to rest. What other mysterious corporation do you know within the Cyberpunk universe that is manipulative and potentially has rogue AI behind it influencing things from behind the scenes? What other corporation uses technology that is so advanced that even within the universe of Cyberpunk, it is considered paramount to myth? Well, in-game, that corporation is SSI, and, well, who really knows what's behind them, or who's behind them even? Is it a rogue AI? Maybe, who wishes to inhabit our bodies even and run the world from the shadows? Or is it, as I mentioned, Night Corp, itself a very mysterious corporation whose supposed sole focus is the running of Night City? Or is it even a conglomeration of different corps trying to pull the strings? Probably not. You see, that's where this video would have originally ended, leaving it up to you on whether or not you thought ITS was being manipulated from behind the scenes from some of the universe's biggest players. However, I came across some new information that changes things a little bit. Because you see, I was never really convinced of the last theory. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? There is a reason I called it a wild theory. More than that, I think a good theory needs evidence, and none of the previous two really have any at all. So, I did one last round of researching on exactly what ITS could be. What I found, however, was something more concrete. Something real. 3, ITS is real. Now, what do I mean when I say ITS is real? After all, this corporation, which created Soulkiller and set off a chain of events that could be argued led to the near destruction of the Cyberpunk universe, I mean, this can't possibly be a real corporation, right? Well, you see, there is something you should know about the older editions of Cyberpunk, which is that in these older editions, there was a multitude of real-life corporations which had survived the chaos of the collapse and were thriving by Cyberpunk 2013. Colt, Walter, Toyota, Nissan, and in 2020 there was Ferrari, Mercedes-Benz, hell, even McDonald's. So it's not out of the realm of possibility for ITS to have been real. But if that's the case, then what is or was the original real-world ITS? Well, it just so happens there is a real ITS Corp, and surprisingly, it is also vague and kind of mysterious as its fictional counterpart is. The real ITS it's complicated, a corporation that provided or provides, you get the point, information technology and engineering services for the United States military and its security apparatus. It was acquired in 2007, shortly before the death of its founder, Bruce Crothers, who founded ITS in 1974 after serving many years in the United States Air Force. Bruce Crothers would pass away in a city called OJ, I think, which is in Ventura County, California, which is where the real ITS Corp was headquartered. The original location for R. Talsorian Games, the people behind Cyberpunk, was in Berkeley, California. Also of note, Mike Pondsmith, the founder of R. Talsorian Games' father, was in the United States Air Force. Finally, nestled in between the almost 6-hour drive between Berkeley and OJ is a little city called Morro Bay, or as you would better know it as, Night City. So, is it so unreasonable that a person who lived in California and made the foundational parts of their game's lore and universe around said state would include a nice little Easter egg reference to a corporation that existed in California, and which in the real world is also vague and offers weird services to the government, and then put them in the role of a vague mysterious corporation in the first adventure that is supposed to introduce you to the setting? This brings us to the core foundational question of this video, and I promise you, the actual final question of this video. Why, if that's the case, is ITS still here? Why, after all this time, is it still part of the story? Is it actually this reference to a real-world corp that existed? And why is it seemingly so important to every version of Cyberpunk and yet so unimportant at the same time that there's no information about it? And more than that, this is something so benign that straight up deleting it from the script of the story wouldn't change the story really at all. Seriously, looking back, this is something I should have mentioned earlier, but hey, future me is smarter than past me. This is a detail that is not only mentioned in the video game, but we know that the events that happen in-game don't match the actual story at all because Johnny's Ingram's memories of the event are heavily clouded via degradation and because of the actual biases of the original Johnny Silverhand. And it's also hinted at that Johnny was potentially a cyber psycho during this event as well, and we for sure know that messes your mind up something fierce, and yet this little detail is still here, and all I have to ask is, why? And to be entirely honest with you, I don't have an answer to that. I just don't know. And really, I think there's only one person who does. But why did I make this video then if I don't have a satisfying conclusion? Well, it's been a detail that's been bothering me forever, but more than that, this highlights something about Cyberpunk that elevates it from being a bad, terrible game to a great one. It's that it has a lot of lore that makes the story interesting. It has a lot of detail that can be extrapolated from it, meaning that it's a deep world, it's an interesting world, and it's one that I am keen and very invested in and want to explore and find out all the little secrets in it, whether that be AI to references to old companies to anything else. Cyberpunk is a universe I want to explore more of and I want to see more content from. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed. Next video will be something. Thank you for your support on the last one. Hope to see you next time. See ya.